In the summer of 1931, during a courthouse renovation in coastal South Carolina, a clerk discovered a narrow leather-bound ledger wedged behind a false wall. No title, no seal, only a smell, iron and mold and something sweet that had turned. The first page listed births. Not names of mothers, not names of fathers, only dates and skin tones. Female, mulatto, born pale. Male, white passing. Female, pale enough. 18 entries, all within 22 years. All attributed to the same unnamed woman. And beside each birth record, written in a different hand, the same symbol appeared again and again, a small cross drawn backward, its lower stem split into two prongs. The clerk, trained to ignore what could not be filed, turned the page. That is where the screaming started. Not literal screams, but the archival kind. Margins filled with revisions. Ink blotted over older ink. Names overwritten by scripture. Dates shifted forward, then backward. Entire baptisms crossed out with the word reassigned. At the center of the ledger, a single line appeared, written larger than the rest. The mother must not be named. No plantation ledger should read like this. No birth record should feel ashamed. But this one did. And beneath that sentence, someone had written, so faintly it was almost prayer, she remembers. They never recorded her name. That is the first violence. In every census, every estate inventory, every baptismal record, she exists only as a function. A body that produces. A vessel that delivers. A woman whose identity dissolves the moment the child arrives. But she left fingerprints on history anyway. Plantation correspondence from the early 1800s references her indirectly, always in tense, uncomfortable language. The woman from the East Quarters. The one who births light. Keep her separate. She was purchased young, between 12 and 14, according to shipping manifests. Listed as healthy. No scars noted. No remarks about temperament. That came later, after the first child. The infant was pale enough to pass. Hair straight. Eyes light. The overseer's wife reportedly refused to look at it. The child was removed before sunrise and delivered to a minister 3 counties away. No explanation given. Then it happened again, and again, and again, 18 times. Always the same outcome. The child vanishes into church networks, orphanages, seminaries, or good homes. The mother is returned to the quarters with her hands bound and her mouth worn shut. But the violence escalates. Later letters speak of her resistance. Not loud, not physical, but spiritual. She would not sing hymns. She would not kneel. She stared at the ground as if listening to something beneath it. One letter, dated 1826, states, "She does not cry anymore. That worries them." Another warns, "She remembers every face." The plantation kept her alive far longer than expected. Women in her condition rarely survived repeated childbirth. But she did, as if something would not let her die yet. And when she finally did, there was no grave. Only a blank line in the ledger where her name should have been. The children were never told who they were. That was the second violence. Each child entered the world as a contradiction, born of chains, yet granted access to freedom through appearance alone. Pale skin became a key. Straight hair a passport. Silence a survival mechanism. They were placed carefully. One into a Methodist orphanage that later burned. One into a Catholic seminary whose archives were sealed by request. One adopted by a judge who changed the boy's surname twice. All records show the same anomaly. Their origins are aggressively incomplete. No maternal history. No birth location. No medical notes. Just a priest's signature. Or a notary's seal. Or a line reading, verified by the church. Several descendants, interviewed nearly a century later, reported the same recurring childhood dream. A woman standing in water. Up to her knees. Up to her waist. Up to her chest. Always reaching forward. Never speaking. One man described waking with the taste of iron in his mouth. Another recalled an unexplainable fear of church bells. Psychologists would later call it inherited trauma. The documents call it something else. Residual memory. The backward cross appears again here, drawn in the margins of baptismal certificates, sometimes scratched into the paper hard enough to tear through. Someone wanted these children claimed. Someone also wanted them forgotten. The final horror does not come from speculation. It comes from penmanship. A forensic historian in the 1970s noticed something no one else had wanted to see. The handwriting in the Plantation's private correspondence matches the annotations in the church records. Same slant, same pressure, same hesitation before writing certain words. The overseer did not write them. The minister did not write them. The plantation owner did. The man whose sermons warned against impurity. The man whose donations built the orphanage. The man whose name appears nowhere near the births, yet everywhere around them. Every child bore his features. Every correction protected his reputation. Every crossed-out name preserved the illusion of moral order. And the woman? She was the only witness, which is why the ledger ends with one final note, written years after her death. The mother is gone. The risk remains. The church did not burn. That rumor came later, useful, dramatic, untraceable. In truth, the building still stands. White clapboard, narrow windows, a bell tower that leans slightly east, as if listening for something beneath the soil. What vanished were the records. Between 1819 and 1843, the church accepted at least 9 infants with no recorded mothers. Parish registries from those years showed deliberate gaps, entire months removed with a razor, not torn, not lost. Cut clean. The remaining pages carry a strange pattern. Baptisms performed at night. Infants baptized twice. Names assigned, revoked, then reassigned again. One entry reads, "The child must not be spoken of until the water settles." No explanation follows. Local oral histories describe the same minister locking the doors during certain ceremonies. No congregation, no witnesses, only the infant, the font, and prayers spoken too low to transcribe. Years later, when investigators attempted to reconstruct the records, they noticed something unsettling. The church's bell was rung on nights with no scheduled service, always 9 minutes long. Never 10, never 8, 9. The same number as the children placed through this building. The minister died without confession. His personal Bible was found with pages fused together, as if soaked and dried repeatedly. In the margins of Genesis, a phrase was written over and over in cramped ink. What is born pale must be carried quietly. No church doctrine supports this, but someone needed it to be true. The orphanage appears ordinary in photographs. Brick facade, neat rows of windows, children standing stiffly in pressed clothing, eyes trained just past the camera. But census data reveals something impossible. Children enter, children leave, but almost none age in place. A boy arrives at 6, leaves at 6. A girl enters at 8, exits at 8. Not deaths, not adoptions, transfers. Always to institutions affiliated with the same network of churches. Always accompanied by a handwritten note bearing the backward cross. Former staff, interviewed decades later, described a rule that was never written down. Certain children were not to be touched, not hugged, not disciplined, not prayed over. One woman recalled being told, they already belonged to something. At night, some of the children sleepwalked. They gathered in the hallway, standing silently, facing the same direction, toward the river, 3 miles away. None of them remembered doing it. Medical reports note recurring symptoms: iron deficiency, nightmares of drowning, and a shared aversion to mirrors. One file contains a child's drawing. A woman with no face. A body submerged. 18 lines extending upward. Each line ends in a child's head. The drawing was labeled simply, family. To pass was not freedom. It was a ritual. Each child was taught, explicitly or implicitly, to sever themselves from origin, to deny memory, to reject instinct. They were instructed never to return south, never to ask about birth, never to speak of dreams. Several later wrote journals. Most destroyed them. One surviving entry reads, "I feel washed when I succeed." Another, "My reflection looks relieved when I lie." Psychologists studying descendants noticed patterns of dissociation, religious fixation, and compulsive secrecy. Entire family lines developed traditions of silence. Rooms never discussed, letters never opened, names never repeated. And always, beneath it all, water. Bathtubs avoided. Rivers feared. Rain endured but not enjoyed. One descendant described standing ankle-deep in a lake and experiencing sudden nausea, followed by a certainty. She is counting. Counting what? The births. The losses. The forgetting. Passing was meant to erase the mother. Instead, it preserved her, as absence. The backward cross was never explained. It appears nowhere in official doctrine. No denomination claims it. No ritual texts reference it, yet it is everywhere, scratched into pews, etched faintly on baptismal silver, drawn in chalk on orphanage cellar floors. Always inverted, always split at the base. An archivist once suggested it was not a cross at all, but a map. The vertical line, the river; the horizontal, the land; the split stem, a body standing where water meets earth. A woman, divided but not gone. The last appearance of the symbol occurs in the ledger's final pages, dated 1851. Next to the final child's reassignment, someone wrote, "She will stop when they remember." But they never did. The river is not where it used to be. Old maps prove that. Survey charts from the early 1800s show a gentle bend near the plantation's eastern edge, a shallow crossing used by wagons, children, livestock. But by the 1860s, the river's curve shifts sharply south, cutting away several acres of land that no longer appear on any modern deed. Officially, it was erosion. Unofficially, locals stopped fishing there. They said the water tasted wrong, that metal tools rusted faster, that animals refused to drink. During drought years, when the river receded, shapes emerged in the mud, lines too straight to be natural. Rectangles, depressions, long impressions like knees pressed into earth. One former surveyor wrote in his notes, "The ground remembers pressure." That phrase appears nowhere else in his work. Church elders insisted the area be avoided. Children were warned away with stories of quicksand and snakes. But the real fear was quieter. At night, the river made noise. Not rushing, not flowing, counting. There was never a cemetery for the enslaved on the plantation. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the land behind the quarters, an open field that was never plowed, never planted, never built upon. Generations passed, and it remained untouched. Ground-penetrating surveys conducted decades later revealed disturbed soil. Many disturbances, but no remains, no bones, no coffins, no artifacts, just cavities, as if something had been removed, or as if something had never been allowed to settle. One historian noted a pattern. The cavities formed a rough semicircle facing the river. At the center, an empty space large enough for a single body. A woman's body. Church correspondence references a containment problem shortly after her death. One letter reads, "The ground refuses her." Another warns, "Do not move her again." Again, moved from where? No records explain it. But a child's rhyme, collected in the 1920s, offers something closer to the truth. She was laid where the water could hear her. They covered her mouth with earth. But the river kept answering. By the late 1800s, the town redraws itself. Roads shift. Property lines blur. Certain parcels vanish entirely. One map labels the river bend as unstable land. Another simply leaves it blank. Town meetings from that era show an unusual preoccupation with order, moral order, spiritual order, racial order. Sermons grow longer. Laws grow stricter. Silence becomes policy. A schoolteacher writes, "Children ask why the river bends away from us." She is dismissed that same year. Residents report shared dreams. A woman standing at the river's edge. Not threatening, not pleading, waiting, always waiting. The town responds by forgetting harder. Names change. Histories compress. Stories are told without endings. But the land does not comply. Houses built too close to the old fields sink unevenly. Wells fill with silt. Foundations crack in straight vertical lines, like scars reopening. One homeowner describes waking to damp footprints on the floor. Bare, muddy, leading nowhere. She left no grave. She left no portrait. She left no recorded name. But she left something else. Patterns. 18 children scattered across institutions. 18 lines of influence threading through families who never spoke of origin. 18 absences pulling at the land like gravity. The documents call her a risk. The town called her forgotten. But forgetting is not erasure. It is containment. And containment always leaks. The first pattern was insomnia. Not ordinary sleeplessness, but a refusal of rest, as if sleep itself had become unsafe. Across multiple family lines, medical records show the same complaint appearing generation after generation, waking at exactly the same hour every night. 3:17 a.m. No explanation. One descendant, a lawyer in Ohio, described waking with the sensation of standing in water, sheets soaked with sweat, feet numb, the certainty that if he moved, something would notice. Another reported hearing a woman breathe beside the bed, slow, patient, not threatening. Waiting. Doctors prescribed sedatives. Pastors suggested prayer. Neither worked. Because the source was not chemical. It was ancestral. In 1978, a graduate seminar at a Midwestern university gained temporary access to the Plantation ledger. They treated it clinically. That was their mistake. As the professor read the entries aloud, birth dates, reassignment notes, the repeated absence of a mother's name, students reported physical reactions. Nausea, pressure in the chest, sudden grief with no object. One student began to cry when the 18th birth was read. She later explained, "It felt finished, like something was finally allowed to stop." That night, the ledger was returned to storage. The next morning, the archivist found the final page altered. No new ink, no handwriting, just a faint watermark that had not been there before. The outline of a woman's face. Families began to fracture. Unexplained arguments. Sudden confessions. Old photographs surfacing from attics where no one remembered putting them. One man discovered a baptismal certificate with the backward cross drawn so deeply it had left an impression on the table beneath it. A woman traced her genealogy and found 18 missing links. Entire maternal lines that simply stopped. Not ended. Stopped. Several descendants independently returned to the river. None planned to. Each described the same impulse. I needed to stand where she stood. Some felt relief. Some felt fear. One felt nothing and never spoke again. The final letters in the archive are not demands. They are requests, written long after her death, by those who had begun to suspect the truth. Say her name. Acknowledge the births. Let the ground close. No one knew her name, but they knew what she was. A witness. A mother. A woman erased so completely that her absence shaped generations. The horror was never supernatural. It was institutional. The terror was not her persistence. It was the effort required to silence her. They searched for her name. Historians. Archivists. Descendants driven by a need they could not articulate. Bills of sale. Shipping manifests. Church margins. Probate lists. Nothing. Not because it was lost. Because it was never allowed to live long enough to be written twice. In one torn corner of a plantation expense ledger, a single letter appears, written, scratched out, written again, then blotted until unreadable. A historian noted that the pressure marks beneath the ink suggest repetition. Someone tried to write the same name over and over, and stopped. Why? Because naming her would have collapsed the structure. A named woman is a person. A person can testify. A testimony can destroy institutions. The system that exploited her depended on her remaining a function, not a self. And yet, across descendants, across documents, across dreams, the same sound appears. A phonetic echo. A whispered syllable that does not belong to English. Not a name, but close. The last act was unintentional. In the early 1990s, a local historical society published a neutral, bloodless pamphlet about the plantation, carefully worded, legally safe. But they included a reproduction of one page from the ledger, the one with all 18 births. Within weeks, letters arrived. People recognized themselves. A woman from Michigan wrote, "This is my grandfather's handwriting." A man from Georgia wrote, "My family told us never to ask where we came from." Exposure does not arrive like revelation. It arrives like pressure equalizing. Slow, painful, irreversible. At the next drought, the river receded again. For the first time, bones surfaced. Not human. Animal. Placed deliberately. Markers. Someone, long ago, had tried to anchor her memory, to keep it from moving, spreading, remembering itself. It did not work. There was no curse. No ghost. No revenge. What haunted the town, the families, the institutions was simpler and more unbearable. She knew who the father was. And they knew she knew. Every birth tightened the noose. Every child who passed as white was evidence walking free. Every act of erasure was an admission of guilt. The horror was not that she lingered. The horror was that she was correct. That the system required silence to survive. That faith was weaponized to launder harm. That whiteness was used as absolution. And that an unnamed woman carried the entire contradiction in her body, again and again, until history tried to pretend she never existed. But forgetting does not absolve. It accumulates. The final line is not a warning. It is not a threat. It is not even written in ink. Under ultraviolet light, Archivists found an impression pressed so hard it scarred the paper. No letters, just pressure, as if someone had leaned down and whispered into the page. But one archivist, alone in the room, swore she heard words. Not angry, not loud, only tired. I carried them. That is the end of the record. No justice followed. No reparations. No monument. Only recognition. And sometimes, that is the most terrifying thing of all. Because recognition means responsibility. And responsibility means the past is no longer silent. This was not a ghost story. It was a record. And records, once read, do not go back to sleep.